retention of the carbon that's already within them, almost maybe more than enhancing what carbon they can store. But with a growing interest in maybe the hierarchy of the different habitats within our estuaries, and maybe how we can enhance some or extend some to be able to capture more of that carbon. Our estuaries are sort of meters deep with mud, and there's a huge amount there. It's quite easy for me because a lot of this fits in very much with the sort of the wildlife conservation, and I have a particular interest in trying to engage the wider catchment communities and encouraging them to realise that they have a footprint remotely on the health of the estuaries downstream of themselves.
Thank you very much. My name's Jill Westcott, background as an economist, also helping grow and deliver veg boxes, work with transition initiatives in Exeter and elsewhere. So one of the problems that I've noticed is that Emily, who is doing the timing and will do this if we tend to go on, I will reflect Emily, because you can't see her mostly. And if you see me doing this, it means could you round up, please? Okay. And Patrick, are you ready to join us visually? And I will ask you to introduce yourself. And because we only have Patrick for half an hour at most, I'm going to ask him to make his contribution first, and that we will then have a little time of discussion, hopefully, while you are still with us to leave. So if you'd like to introduce yourself as well, Patrick, and head off on what you would like to say to us.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I'm sorry not to be with you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
My name is Patrick Coleman. I'm a farm in Wales, and I've been here since 1973. And I propose to just say a little bit about, having had most of your introductions, just say a little bit about what, the big picture as I see it, and then a little bit about my farm, and then talk about my organisation, the Sustainable Food Trust, and what we're trying to do to unlock what we see to be the key barriers to change. So just to start with, I know this is probably a view shared by everyone, but it's pretty obvious that our planet is in trouble, and the big picture is that we are exceeding the carrying capacity of the planet in multiple ways, amongst which some of the key areas all come back to our farming and food systems. So if we're going to avoid irreversible climate change and the ecological breakdown and destruction of biodiversity and all the other things that are threatening us, it probably needs a global change in our food systems, starting from the ground up, and not just an ecological niche like, organic farming or agroecological around the edges of otherwise conventional farming. The total transition, we probably haven't got more than 10 or 15 years to put that into place. And right now, things are not going in the right direction. So we haven't got very long. There's an urgency for change, and it all starts on the farm, because as Vandana Shiva said recently, the pristine wilderness areas of the planet used to be its lungs and its digestion and everything, but now it's the small farms, because they occupy the majority of the land area. So if the farms are sick, then the planet is sick, and we are sick, and we have to do something about that. So I had a sort of inkling of that 46 years ago when I moved down here with a bunch of hippies in 1973 and set up this farm. We didn't really know what we were doing, but we tried to farm in a sustainable way. And today we're a 300-acre farm. We milk 80 Ayrshire cows. We're trying to follow the principles of the circular economy, trying to build the natural and human capital that we're looking after here, at the same time produce as much of a surplus as food as we can, unlike Isabella Tree, who I just heard on Desert Island Discs, who with her husband Charlie is rewilding, which is lovely, but personally I think that the challenge we need to respond to is to work out how we can farm in harmony with nature and produce food at the same time. Not that I'm against rewilding, but I just don't think it's the key issue of our time. The problem is that at present, doing the right thing doesn't pay well enough for it to go mainstream. as we know. So just to say what we've done along the road, we've grown wheat and milled it and sold it to a local whole food shop in Aberystwyth. We used to be carrot growers and we sold to supermarkets, but they closed all the local pack houses. We ended up having to supply a pack house in Peterborough, 230 miles away from the farm, so we had to give up. That was in 2006, having grown carrots for 26 years here. And so now we're just making most of our milk into cheese. The cheese is a single farm raw milk cheddar called Havon, and it sells well, but at an expensive price. And our main buyer is Neal's Yard Dairy, and ironically, a lot of our cheese is exported to America and Australia and other places. So we're not even practicing a local food system, even though that is our aspiration. And we're also producing veal from our male dairy calves, which we're struggling to sell, which is another barrier to change. So we're trying to do the right thing. We'd like to be more diverse than we are. We've ended up being mainly a cheese producer at a price which is too expensive to get into supermarkets. So we're supplying, more specialist markets. And although we can do what we're doing here, we can't take it to scale unless we unlock some of the barriers to change. The way that I thought it would be the best way to do that back in the 80s was to set up a different market for food produced in a sustainable way, and that's to develop the organic standards, which I had quite a lot to do with when I was working at the Soil Association. The market today is whatever it is, 2.5% of the total market, but it's sort of self-limiting because you have to charge a significant premium for the food. A lot of people just don't want to pay that much more for their food, and if the food produced from intensive farming appears cheap when it isn't really, and the food from organic farming appears expensive, and that's not really fair. So that really brings me to my work at the Sustainable Food Trust, which we set up in 2011, and our mission was to accelerate the transition to more sustainable food systems locally and globally. But in doing that, because we're only a small organisation, we wanted to try to unlock some of the key barriers to change. And the first barrier we came across was economic, as I've just described. So the polluter doesn't pay, and the subsidies and the support for agriculture is directed in the wrong way. So small-scale agroecological systems of farming, regenerative farming, doesn't pay as well as unsustainable farming. You can't blame the farmers for that. They're being supported through a kind of social security check, about £80 an acre, supplemented by the Pillar 2 payments, the stewardship payments, which are about £20 an acre. And for as long as that system is in place, effectively farmers are incentivised to use the most cost-effective means of production, which is to use nitrogen fertiliser and pesticides, and produce cheap food, thereby becoming commodity slaves for big markets, which are purchased by big food companies and then processed and sold with heavily branded products with no problems whatsoever. And that's the food system we've got. And what I've noticed during the 46 years we've been farming here is that when we first arrived, there were still small abattoirs and local food processing operations in the local community, but they've all sort of progressively disappeared during the time we farmed here. So now we've got a system, highly centralised production, processing, distribution, which it makes it very, very difficult for small-scale producers to find a market unless they carve out quite a small-scale niche, which we've tried to do. My daughter Alice is doing. She's working for growing communities in London as a salad grower in Dagenham. And what we need, if we're going to unlock this and enable truly sustainable farming and food systems to go to scale, it seems to me is what you're talking about, to recreate the relocalised infrastructure which has disappeared over the post-war period, and which would then create the opportunity for sustainable farming to go to scale. And in pursuit of that, we've written a report called The Hidden Costs of UK Food, which identifies that for every pound that's spent on food, there's another hidden pound of externalised costs, which are not borne by the public and the consumer, but are paid for in hidden ways in our water bills and NHS costs and all that sort of thing. And then related to that, we think that the way in which food subsidies should be directed in the future should be targeted so that farmers get rewarded for sustainable farming across the whole of their farms and not pay to do stewardship around the edges. And we've been working, when Michael Gomes in DEFRA, we had some influence on him, but now he's gone, and I think there's not a very intelligent attempt in DEFRA, that we're also working with the Welsh Government, who look as if they're going to introduce an annual farm sustainability audit throughout for all farms in Wales, which will be conditional for the receipt of public funds after Brexit goes ahead. And we think that that system of supporting farmers could be really good, because it would then shift the balance of economic advantage towards sustainable farming away from the farming systems that we have at the moment. We're also working on the metrics which the farming system could be evaluated against. We've set up a farmers and land managers working group about 4 years ago, which has developed the framework for this annual farm sustainability assessment, which includes soil, water, emissions, energy and resource use, nutrient cycling, crop and livestock management, and social and cultural impact, with metrics, 3 high-level metrics for each of those categories, as well as productivity and profitability. And the idea would be that for every farm that wants to be eligible for public support, to complete that annual audit. And we've been selected by DEFRA for one of the tests and trials, and we've got funding for 25 farms in England. And we just had a meeting at Cirencester for the farmers who put themselves forward. There is still some possibility for more farms to join, which it might be worth discussing, because there's some people at Northwick who have got some funding that would be possibly eligible for that if there are some Devon farmers that wanted to join in with that. So I think I'll stop now and let's open up discussion. But what I would say is that we need a new inclusive way of evaluating sustainability, which would then be the basis upon which governments and others could reward farmers who are farming in a more sustainable way and delivering social, cultural and environmental benefits. In an ideal world, we want that to be linked to a food labelling system without necessarily destroying all the existing labels. So you could have, for instance, an organic label or leaf or red tractor or whatever, which had a score on it, which showed the degree of sustainability of the farm, say a score of 100, which would give people buying food much more information about, how grass-fed it was or whatever it was. So, the fair trade thing could come in as well. And that way, you would connect up sustainable farming in a better way with the marketplace. And that could be a self-assessment scheme, so it would take some of the cost out. Because we had our Soil Association inspection here yesterday, and it's a bit of an ordeal, to put it mildly. At the end of it, you just are relieved you passed the inspection, but you don't know anything more about how sustainable your farming was last year compared to the year before. So that's a very rushed kind of journey through our kind of work. How can we support your initiative? I don't know, but we'd love to support your initiative, because it sounds as if you're trying to do all of exactly the right things. And it seems to me that new models for getting food, sustainably produced food, to markets in cities and towns is like the biggest challenge of all in transforming our food systems, because that infrastructure hardly exists at the moment. The question is how we can recreate it.
Thank you very much, Patrick. That's a great start to our discussion. And just to say that we have been joined by Andrew Bell, who is from the North Devon AM. Should I say that? The Biosphere Reserve there, and will introduce himself when it comes to it. Could you just indicate if you want to speak? I'm sure there is a lot that people might have to say in response.
I think the sustainability audit of all farms is a great idea, and I think hopefully we'll see part of that coming through in Elms. And I know we've had a little bit of this conversation before, Patrick, but I feel really, really strongly about farmers doing the most sustainable things and having to pay for additional labelling for their products. And I raised this issue with Michael Gove at the Oxford Real Farming Conference a couple of years ago. But I think if we're genuinely seriously committed to the polluter pays principle, it is imperative that we change the labelling of all food so that it reflects so that farmers who are farming as we wish them to do so should not have to pay a premium to carry that label on their product, but rather the farmers who are farming in a way that is detrimental to our society and our planet should carry a warning label. It's what we do with every other product in a supermarket. fresh fruit and vegetables and fish are the only products that don't come with a label that warn you if it's high in fat or high in sugar. We should have labels that say actually this is massively high in fertiliser or high in antibiotics, so that farmers that are doing the right thing aren't financially penalised for doing the right thing, whereas farmers, and we create a market incentive for consumers to make more sustainable decisions.
I think you're right, but I think we don't want to demonise the farmers who are just following the best business case. So I think that what our scheme would do, it would make all the things you say transparent without making farmers feel bad. It just reveal it. So if you're farming in quite an intensive way, you'd get a low score, and I think that would be the way to do it. And also, if it was a self-assessment scheme, it would take a lot of the cost out of it. We're having 5 audits a year, and we're paying a lot of money for those audits, and a lot of them are just collecting duplicated information, which could all change if we had a single audit per year. Can I just say one other thing? I think one of the measurements that we want to collect is nutrition per acre. Because one of you mentioned, no, I think it's actually Isabella Tree on Desert Island just mentioned that a tomato has a tenth of the nutrition it used to. Well, if we measured the nutritional content of the food that we grew, it would completely transform the case for more sustainable farming, because the food that's grown properly in good soil would carry a high nutrient capacity. And one other thing I would also like to just mention very quickly, we're very involved in the discussion about what to eat to be healthy and sustainable. We think we should link our future diets to the productive capacity of the landscape where we live. And I'm going to be on the food programme with George Monbiot and Tara Garnett on Sunday, having a debate about this, because I think that those academics and campaigners who urged us to adopt a plant-based diet are out of touch with the realities of agriculture and don't understand that if we want to rebuild soil fertility, we need a mix of crops and livestock in a regenerative rotation. And so we're holding out the flag, the flame for grass-fed and mainly grass-fed ruminant livestock, and saying that we think that there's been a lot of misinformation in the Eat Lancet report and all these other recent reports, mostly written by academics who don't understand agriculture. Over.
Thank you, Patrick. So we'll go Steve and then Marina, please. Thank you.
Mine's more of a question, really. I wondered where aquaculture fitted into the mix of things. It seems to often fall between fisheries and land-based aquaculture. However, it's an incredibly important tool and resource for us going forward. So I just wondered who in essence was keeping an eye on it and involving it within the whole systems approach.
Well, that's probably not a question for me. We haven't been specialised in aquaculture, but I think there's traditional aquaculture systems which are really laudable, and marine aquaculture has probably largely failed so far because it's used the salmon farming and all the rest of it has got so many problems with it. But land-based aquaculture probably has a big future potential, it seems to me. I just don't know enough about it to be an authority.
But I'm thinking, again, traditionally people think about salmon farming, but things like mussel ropes and particularly a growing interest in seaweed farming as well. I know there's the Cornish Seaweed Company, but seaweeds could well be a developing market that I think within Devon we're well placed to make use of. The products you can get from seaweed through food items, through fertilizer type things, as well as high-end pharmaceutical products and other kind of industrial products. I think if we move the public away from this concept of salmon farms, actually marine aquaculture, mariculture, multiple species mariculture is something we really need to pay more attention to.
I'm sure that's absolutely right.
Thank you. Yes, I just wanted to follow up with the point that Patrick made about looking at a regional food distribution network, because we have a great opportunity in Devon to perhaps look at an aggregated regional food distribution network. We have such a wealth of farming expertise and innovation in the area, and there's already, I know, quite a lot of different people who are already looking at this. So Dominic Ackland is working with the Resonance Foundation with Simon Platten and others to look at a pilot model of a regional food distribution network, and that could be scaled up. And that has just, within it, it just contains so many opportunities sort of spinning out of that around potential sustainable food procurement. And it's a way of perhaps supporting the local producers to get good sustainable food into our communities at a more affordable cost.
And what's the crucial thing that will make that happen?
I think at the moment it needs funding, and it needs, so the project going on at the moment is a pilot. So, and I'm very, very vaguely involved with that, but not really. So we'll have to wait to see what the findings are. But I think then it will involve some will from various sectors, I think, and some support.
I think that's the crucial question. The question you just asked is what are the bits that would make this happen? Because if you look at all the alternative ways of getting food to market at the moment, I've got some great friends down the road called Peter Seger and Anne Evans, and they used to supply supermarkets, and now they sell all their vegetables from about 50-acre farm in Wales, mainly on farmers' markets. But the question is, how can the distribution of locally produced food go to scale from where it is at the moment, which is, just in the margins where committed people go to farmers' markets, or maybe they're in a box scheme, big or small. What are the missing links which would then enable sustainable food to be produced at scale by all the farmers who are effectively commodity slaves at the moment and losing money and not enjoying what they're doing? Because I think there are massive numbers of farmers who would like to do something different to be part of the solution if they knew what it was.
Okay, we have Harriet, and then Alison, Ruth, and Nicola.
I would really agree with that point, and I know that the Sustainable Food Trust has been doing some great work on relocalising abattoir chains, and I would add into that, and it's certainly something that we found at Dartington, that there is other processing kit missing from the area that would enable us to do that better, particularly like dehydration, storage facilities, cold storage facilities, that are accessible to people. And I am aware that there are grants out there, kind of RDPE grants that are available to farmers to bring this kind of kit in, but they usually involve quite substantial match funding. And I think one of the challenges of the farming community is that they often end up carrying vast amounts of debt, because they go into diversification. They require a lot of very substantial upfront investment in that kind of kit, and then they carry that debt, and it has a huge impact on the sustainability and profitability of their farms. And then the other thing we throw in, and it's kind of an idealist thing, is that I completely agree with you about kind of networks of food distribution, but I think everything should be doing more than one thing. So I think there's a huge opportunity if we're looking at relocalised networks of food distribution, that we look at how that can play back into renewable energy or waste management. So you don't have just fleets taking food out, but you look at how you can use those fleets coming back to look at the role that farms can play, for example, as renewable energy hubs for their community.
And just to build on that, I think the idea of making something dual purpose, I think is really important, because what we don't want to do is create something that then doesn't support our local communities and the shops and services that are in our local communities. So through this regional distribution, let's try and support some of our local shops and get people into our local shops so they support our communities as well as our farming communities. I think that's absolutely crucial that we do that. But I think that as well as the distribution, we've got to look at the other side of the coin here, and we've got to look at how we change people's perceptions, the consumers' perceptions, wanting to go and buy that local food, understanding that link between local food, carbon, the environment. And I think, we started to do a lot of work around this last time we started talking about climate change, and it's just gone off the agenda again. Now's the right time to do it, but are there good examples out there? How do we actually start making that change in society?
Can I just chip in a couple of other points, because I know that you'll probably want to move on. I want to just make the case for small abattoirs, because they were just mentioned. Our campaign for small abattoirs has raised some profile, but so far, the demise of small abattoirs is still continuing. And it just strikes me that this is such an important point, because you cannot have local meat unless you have local abattoirs. So it's really something to, bear in mind. We're going to relocalise food systems, and the link to that, it seems to me that public procurement is a low-hanging fruit opportunity. Because if you think of all the meals that are served on the public plate, including schools, hospitals, care homes, if the list goes on, if you could get a commitment for a significant percentage of sustainably sourced, locally produced, seasonal food to go into all those public plate meals, this would be potentially a huge market at scale, which would then create the demand for relocalised infrastructure, which doesn't exist at the moment, and an economic case for it. The third last point is we're working on a project called the Harmony Project with a man called Richard Duck, who's a head teacher of a primary school in the Thames Valley, who's been trying to embed harmony principles into his education scheme, because his premise is that our current education system doesn't prepare our young children to make sense of the world in which they find themselves, or to know how to make it a better place. And if we start in schools, that's very disruptive and subversive, because it doesn't take long before children become active in society. So I think there's an education element to this as well.
Thank you, Patrick. I think we agree very much. And I don't know how long you would like to maintain with us, but you probably need to do other things. So please go when you feel able, and we will continue with our discussion here.
Well, thank you very much for giving this space. And if there's anything we can do to support what you are developing, we'd be happy to do that if it's possible.
I think Alison has a point if you want to hang on for a second.
I just want to say about abattoirs. Of a high nature value farming project across Europe over the last 3 years, and there's some really interesting work going on in Sweden where they've actually got mobile abattoirs, and it's really interesting project, and I think it's that kind of innovation that we might have to start thinking about, and it's much nicer for the animal in terms of their welfare. So I was just saying that there is some innovation that we could learn from Europe. The second thing is that there is something called the Bovie Community Kitchen, which is doing exactly what you talked about, using local food and pushing it out to local care homes and older people in the community. So there are some initiatives that we can learn from here already happening.
Thank you. And then
yes, well, I was going to talk about the public procurement element, because, as Patrick says, it's a very large, user market, and as well as providing that market, it can be a stable market, because this is another thing with farmers producing it. So that, okay, so I'm going to double my production of carrots or whatever it is I'm growing. I can't necessarily guarantee I can sell them, but if I have a contract and it's a decent contract, not like supermarket style ones where you will buy my produce, and this is the sort of thing that does go on in Europe. It's not some pie in the sky thing that happens on the continent. This is very standard behaviour. They want good food into their hospitals and their schools for the reasons we think that. So there's definitely that. I'm struggling to remember the name of the project, but there's something going on in Brazil where it's almost become mandatory that the public should be from localised food systems. So it's not, this is not kind of stuff that isn't happening somewhere else in the local. And on-farm abattoir, I can remember 30 years ago when I was in livestock farming, there were still mobile abattoirs that would come to the farm. In our area in the Otter Valley, we have 2 local abattoirs, so pigs that I was raising on my farm would go 5 miles up the road. So it does still happen. Maybe we need to go and find out how come they're still operating, and why can it not happen elsewhere? These things are still happening, they just can go on.
Can we all try and keep our voices up? I think it doesn't help that we're sitting behind you. But, thank you.
Can I just say about the abattoir thing, that we've got one of the people who are working on our abattoir campaign and trying to develop a mobile abattoir, and I think it's really important that should happen, because the best way for an animal to end its life is as close to the farm where it lived as possible. So I think that's a really important point. And just one other point about how you can work with what already exists. Back in the 80s, when I was, first started growing carrots, I was delivering carrots to the co-op in Lancashire, bunched carrots for about 2 months of the year, and it became quite a big business. But I think that whether or not we like or hate the supermarkets, possibly something to do is to shame them into starting to source local food in a different way. And I was up to 200 bunches a day of carrots delivered into the back of the co-op in Lancashire, and they pride themselves on local, sourcing. And it just seems to me that we could just say, well, the disruptive, emergent new models of food systems are the only way forward to replace the mess we've got at the moment. Or it's just a question, how can we work with the existing, rather badly structured food systems to try to make them turn the corner? It's just a sort of thought.
Okay, we got Nicola and then Harriet.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to a point that Harriet made earlier about the labelling for mass-produced farming goods. I think that the labelling is interesting to include the negatives. I think also, though, what would be very valuable is if we could start to think about how we could include those external costs within the prices. So, Patrick, you mentioned earlier, for every pound of product, there's a pound of external costs in terms of carbon release, NHS costs, water costs. I think that whilst the community and local initiatives are incredibly important, I think we also now need to start taking some national level action about how we shift the costing structures. Because at the end of the day, for a lot of people, the choices they make in the supermarket are not based on labels, they're based on price. And I think until we can start to internalise some of those environmental costs in the mass-produced agriculture systems, I think we're going to struggle to upscale in the way that, Patrick, you're aspiring to.
I couldn't agree more. I think that the prices, let's be honest, it's the price that in the end will prevail. If a chicken is 5 times the price of whatever it is, pasture-fed organic is 5 times the price of a Tesco cheap chicken, what are people going to do? They just don't know about those costs. They don't see them written in the price ticket.
Okay, so it's nearly time for us to move on from this topic. We would also like to have a little bit more focus on practices in soil and on what are the initiatives that we can take locally. But I know there are people waiting to speak on this particular one, so let's do that now. And, I'd like to...
So we have Harriet, Caroline, and then back to
so when I was thinking about what I would say earlier, I couldn't reach a simple conclusion because you just hit these wicked problems that just go everywhere. And I think, so it kind of picking up on your point, Alison, that about food and people being able to cook, and Rebecca's point, and use food properly. I think one of the roles that the council, local government could play is that we know that we need dramatic shifts in the way we organise and run our societies, and actually is for some bold action of like sticking your neck out, being like, well, actually, our food culture needs to change. We need to build more time for food in. So as councils, we're going to go down to 4-day work weeks. Or as public bodies, we're going to go down to 4-day work weeks in the hope that that extra time that we give our employees will enable them to spend more time on food preparation, on local food sourcing, or on more sustainable behaviours and reducing their kind of carbon travel footprint or something like that. I would love to believe that food could reflect the true cost, but I think politically that is probably unlikely to shift. But it's a good goal.
I think when we're thinking about how to facilitate such huge cultural changes like this, coming back to the supermarkets again, part of the reason they've got such a huge hold is because the economies of scale give them the choice, the price, and the convenience that it's very difficult for small producers to compete with. So I think food hubs, local distribution networks are a really great idea, but also at a national level we have to lobby for more supply chain regulation and regulation of the supermarkets, and that in combination with things like public procurement and local food networks, etc., and a slow shift in culture, I think will work together to create that shift.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a little bit more information about the procurement. Someone else mentioned in Europe, Denmark have hit a 19% public procurement target for organics, which has been met at no extra cost. and this was led by public institutions creating new markets for agroecological farming. And Copenhagen has transformed its public procurement policy with 72% of its food sourced from organic producers. So these are incredibly opportune moments for us to think about how we can make similar transformations, but I agree with what other people are saying. It will take more than just local initiatives. It's going to take some strategic thinking at a local and regional scale, but also some thinking at a national scale as well.
Because that's charitable, thank you very much. It was just to add, say, it goes back to Andy Bell from the Vice Page. It goes back to the discussion about the nutrition part as well, because I think I'm right in hearing that one of the large companies that got the contracts for supplying hospitals is now in danger of losing the contract because the food doesn't have the nutritional value, because they priced it so low that they couldn't actually sort of get the right food in. So now their contract is at risk. So it's one of the easy tricks you could do on the public procurement side is actually specify the nutritional value, which would then actually sort of then start raising the price for all, make it more accessible for more.
I just wanted to say before we finish that 2 points. The Land Workers Alliance Simon Fairley recommends that the costs of organic certification itself should be borne by non-organic producers. And that's a national issue which might be taken up. But also, I'm interested that nobody here has mentioned a carbon tax. So all the measures that we've suggested have been agricultural sector specific, but there are huge arguments from many other sectors as well for having a carbon tax, maybe replacing VAT or to some extent replacing VAT, which would automatically readjust the cost balance between the kind of food you're talking about in those hospital contracts and the food produced by the kind of producers which some of us have been talking about. And I think, I have also received messages from farmers who cannot be present today about the burden of debt that you mentioned, and about the fact that many farmers would like to change their practices but cannot. So it's not just a question of their farm support and subsidies, it's also a question of consumer pricing, and perhaps as advocates on the national scene, we could bear that in mind. Mary Quick says that carbon should be £200 a tonne. Is that an appropriate price? I have no idea.
My concern about focusing so much on carbon is you then lose focus on some of the other costs associated, some of the other environmental hidden costs we don't see. Sometimes it becomes an easy win to say I'm producing the lowest amount of carbon possible. However, some of the practices I employ have much greater environmental impacts and the damage done on the climate.
So yes, absolutely, and so farmers in this country are in such a vulnerable financial position at the moment that I think any more penalties on them would just be counterproductive, because we were losing farms at a great rate anyway, and that would just speed it up. So I think what the Elms are proposing in the current form of the agriculture bill, if it ever materialises, are to be paying and rewarding farmers for things like sequestering carbon, improving biodiversity, etc. And so I think we need to be rewarding farmers for doing the right thing, because that will incentivise them to change their practice.
Thank you. Well, a couple of points. In terms of how agroecological practice competes on a wholesale market basis, one of the things that we have experimented with at Dartington is actually changing the form of a farm business structure. So conventionally, we all think of farms as a kind of square area of land that belongs to one farmer who does one thing. And actually, through our agroforestry project, what we've played with is that actually maybe this isn't the case. So we have 48 acres that now has 6 businesses operating in it. 5 of those are food producing businesses, and 1 of those is a social enterprise delivering a kind of public good, working with children that are having difficulty. And so what we have created is not agroecology, it is a stepping stone between conventional farming and agroecology, but it has been delivered massive environmental gains on very commercially orientated grounds. So it resulted in 2,000 trees being planted in a previously arable field with a silage and arable crop being taken between the rows to deliver, but driven by commercial interest, or driven by a kind of market for the food from those trees. And I think that this is an idea, and it's certainly what I've been interested in playing with more at Dartington, is actually how do we enable farmers to transition towards agroecology and commercially viable ways through more collaborative working patterns, and by maybe changing our very prescribed thinking about what makes a farm and what makes a farmer that we've got, had from the hundreds of thousands of years that we've been farming in this style, although actually, no, we used to farm more collaboratively. And then my other point is about carbon and metrics. So again, this is something that we've looked at Dartington. We were really interested in how we could change the nature of traditional farm business tenancies, so that you could take natural capital items, reflect them in the farm business tenancy, and reward farmers through what's currently referred to as tenants improvements in a farm business tenancy for building natural capital, because that value essentially sits with the landowner, not necessarily the tenant farmer. But it's incredibly difficult, we found it incredibly difficult to identify appropriate metrics. So appropriate by being objectively measurable, appropriate by being affordable to carry out. And actually, I think one of the challenges we have is that not enough research has gone into this area. So most of the research in agriculture goes into areas that are sort of where big business has an opportunity to sell you something, essentially. So, for example, there's the current debate going on about permanent pasture-based systems versus woodland. Which of those captures more carbon? Which of those holds them more effectively? Which of those provides the best levels of biodiversity in return? And there's a real sort of split of opinion about whether it's woodland or whether it's permanent pasture. But actually, what the entire argument reveals is that nobody really knows. Nobody really knows because the data hasn't been done well enough. So people might have been taking soil cores from permanent pasture versus woodland and looking at the kind of soil carbon content within each of those, but they might not have gone deep enough in terms of their soil cores to reflect the true carbon capture capacity of a tree, because they're only going to 2 feet. And actually a tree could potentially be bearing carbon a lot deeper than that. So the lack of data makes it incredibly difficult to make well-informed decisions about these different models. And the other thing I would say is that kind of attempts to reflect natural capital in farm business tenancies, what we realise is that if you're not very careful, there are lots of opportunities to basically create a really messed up system. So one of our tenants who is have been most successful at capturing carbon to date, our agroforestry tenant, he is now plateaued at 16% soil carbon content in his field. So how do you create a system that doesn't penalise him for having got the best out of the system by failing to reward him to keep it up? But it also, you could asset strip a field for years, whack in a kind of, a nice clover crop or something for the couple of years at the end, and your soil carbon content would go up, but it wouldn't affect good practice throughout the whole of your tenancy. So you have to be really careful about the complexity of the system when designing models for assessment.
There's some really good work already being done, primarily in Ireland, but also up in the north around payment for public goods, and the system that you might develop, which actually doesn't mean that if you plateau, you get paid less. Yeah. As long as you maintain it at that level, then you will continue to get the high payment. So there's some really interesting work already being done around this that we could learn from. In Ireland, the Burren area of Ireland. I was thinking as I was sitting here that I've actually heard a lot of this discussion before, and I suppose for me the question I have is, what do we think is the biggest priority for us at the moment that will provide us with the biggest benefit that we think we can achieve together? Because I think, when you've been around in this field for a long time, you do hear the same things going round and round again. And I suppose for me, we've got to the point where we need to start thinking, what do we actually need to do collaboratively to work together to make a big change? That's probably the biggest change we can do realistically for Devon, and I think it'd be a really interesting discussion to have, because I'm not sure I know the answer, but it'd be interesting to see if collectively we've got one.
Well, okay, let's have a stock take, and we've got indications from Isabel, from Caroline, Nicola and Andy waiting to speak. So we're going to break at 11. And just to reflect some of the things that were flagged up in our initial round and in the submissions 2 minutes, which we touched on but not mentioned. are the issue of how do we deal with the conflict between land, access to land for tree planting, rewilding, whatever, with all the additional benefits for water control and so forth. How do we give either incentives or regulations or some kind of mapping to do that? And we do have a suggestion for a land use framework, the Woodland Trust and others, which would identify which areas are best for which. So far, the suggestion is that that should be a negotiated change to land use and maybe reinforced with the availability of grants, but without regulation. We also have had raised the whole issue that it is small farms that seem to be finding it more likely to take on some of the practices such as agroforestry, permaculture, horticulture production, and which if land is lost in pasture for rewilding, then produces a lot of food for the small acreage. How can those kind of enterprises networks? But are there concrete suggestions people can make for how to change our food culture from the point of view of the consumer and the access to affordable?
And I just have one thing to do.
Sorry. Also, is it possible for people to perhaps comment on Patrick's cow in the room about should we be going for a vegan Devon or not? In terms of this is one of the main recommendations of the Commission on Climate Change report, that we need to reduce animal product consumption. Do people in vegan? No, well, I'm just being provocative to get a taste in the room, but is that appropriate for Devon or not? What do the expertise in the room think?
There were a lot of submissions recommending that too.
Yeah.
So we'll go back to the previous.
Just to add one thing also that has been discussed in our previous hearing. It's about being strategic, and there is so much conscience currently about what climate change is, and that people want to do so much for it and to help this from happening. But in their own hands, I'm going to do something to help, but not actually understanding that there has to be a strategy behind it. So we came up, for example, people planting trees, but you cannot just plant trees in a place. You have to actually assess whether that's the right land, and that's the right use for that land, and you are actually planting the right trees. So I'm just putting that on the table, and I think that's important.
So I didn't mean to interrupt the order of people who wanted to speak, but just to encourage extra contributions.
Does that mean we'll do that after the break?
No, I think we want to finish. Ideally, we stop for a break at 11 and then move on to discuss marine issues a little bit more. But we'll see what happens. So we've got Isabel. Who else have we got? Loads of people.
I'd like to talk to what you want to talk about.
Okay. Well, you take the order.
If you want to, you haven't spoken yet. So.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, it's 2 points really. The first one, picking up on the vegan, vegetarian, meat, animals side of it. Fairfax Luxmore, who's a strong advocate, and you probably know him, Ali. Yes, for traditional grazing and traditional livestock. We were both up at the Sustainable Food Trust conference earlier in the year. And if you, President Minette Batters spoke at that very well with some other great speakers. And what Minette was saying is to watch out on this, because we could all get rather holier than thou, and you could do a lot of damage to livestock farming in this country by ill-considered but well-meaning activity, which would then basically just take all the poor carbon practices offshore, be happening halfway around the world. And there's a whole element about animal welfare in that as well, animal welfare standards. So I think that has to be, to me, there's something around that of having meat as a sort of luxury and as a treat, rather than just have loads. I get annoyed with the pubs that do these kind of mixed grills where you've got a week's worth of meat on one plate. I'd feel ill if I had that much meat. And I like meat, but not in that quantity. So I think it's something more sensible about that to be done. And I think in terms of driving the behaviours, I think we've had, as often happens in these situations, there's a lot of emphasis on regulation and government and related, and I think this makes sense because that is, and it's more about the holistic approach. But I think there's a big job to be done on the adjusting demand, and I think there's a big opportunity here with the young people and children, with the great work that Greta Thunberg's done, where she is influencing the world and leading opinion, and young people have really switched on to that. So there's something, I think there's a big opportunity that we need to move into there with the young people being informed and educated and really balanced education, to start driving consumer behaviours, starting with themselves, speaking with their parents and families around it as well. So I think it's massive opportunities. The Friends of the Earth did some good work on there. They had a workshop in Plymouth earlier this week at the Sustainable Earth Institute at Plymouth University there. And they're very keen on building on that and citizen action of various forms, which plays into the Citizens' Assembly. So I think there's a big opportunity there to link up with them on that level. So yeah, thank you. Hope that's helpful.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. Yes, I'd like to follow up on those points around the consumer behaviour. It's a very difficult and challenging area, but the work I've been involved with the Cornwall Food Foundation on their Food for Change programme has shown some interesting results so far, in that it's it's a kind of a resource intensive programme, in that people are going on like 6-week cooking programs and also growing programs, but they're working with disadvantaged communities, so they're working with people who were eating in a completely different way to what we are advocating here. And these programs are transforming their food consumption practices. And so unfortunately, that is a challenging thing to roll out because it is a resource intensive model, but potentially there are opportunities to link up with ideas around farmers markets that have a cooking demonstration on the side, or community-based cooking workshops in community centres that have their regular monthly perhaps. So I think that really needs to be championed, because it can have really dramatic changes in people's diets.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly revisit talking about the environmental land management schemes that are in the proposed agriculture bill, and just raise a concern about that, because while it looks very good, it does still separate out nature conservation from food production, and actually what is being broadly advocated now is combining those two things with agroecology, and because when you separate them, what you end up with is sustainable intensification, which is a bit of an oxymoron, and that's partly led by the fact that most research into sustainable agriculture is done, it's led by where the money is, or potential money. And so I wanted to say that I think the idea of having a sort of a county-wide sort of network of landowners is a really great idea, because we've got to start looking at a county-wide sort of plan, and getting those landowners and farmers on board with that, and educating them as well, and sort of forming some sort of county-wide objectives about where we are now and where we want to move towards. I think it's important. On the meat point, it's all about context and conditions, and actually, Devon, the land in Devon, it's steep, it's slopey, we've got very high rainfall, very high clay content. There's not a lot you can grow on that other than grass in many areas, and so that's a really important consideration. Yes, and when we're talking about appropriate land use in general, we have to be thinking about biodiversity, and so when we think about carbon capturing, we might be thinking about planting up lots of woodland. Mature native woodland is fairly low in biodiversity, and so again, we need to be looking holistically and kind of thinking about biodiversity all the time when we're making these decisions. And another thing on consumer behaviour, like it or not, we are in the midst of a huge surge in nationalism, and I think that we could perhaps try and harness that as a sort of a force of sort of national pride, which could steer people towards wanting to support local farmers, British farmers, and specifically local regional food producers as well.
We can keep this short because it's 3 minutes to 11. So three
break
things.
may be slightly delayed.
The cow in the room. We clearly do need animal manure and animals on the ground in order to put carbon and nutrients and fertility back into the soil. So to go completely vegan does not make sense, really. Another second point, what we can do here, I think that demonstrator farms and farming operations have huge power to influence, particularly if farmers become inspired by seeing what the farm over the road or next door is doing, and then they kind of take that up. And we've seen that happen in the kind of Dartington, Tuckenhay area, where there's a very inspiring biodynamic farm. And in fact, after this meeting, I'm going to go and talk to Mike Peary, who's a farmer in Tuckenhay, who's been inspired by that to see if he can take biodynamic farming onto his farm, where he's practicing wilding, and he's already influencing his local farmers. So there's that kind of knock-on effect, which is very powerful. And then the piece that I really want to bring in here is co-design with all the system in the room. So bring as many bits of the system, of the food system in this particular instance, into a room as possible, and do a co-design process. So you have stakeholders talking about, from their expertise, what they can do, and having these conversations that kind of go from production to distribution to marketing to all these other aspects of farming. Just kind of, let's do that. Not difficult.
I mean, yes, cow in the room, I would say eat mostly plants, but do eat meat, but eat really good quality meat. But I would also say eat horses. Because actually part of the issue that we have with our livestock system isn't just the quantity of animals, it's the variety of animals. So if you look at the rewilding example, one of the things that makes it work is that you have all sorts of different browsing habits mixed together, and that has massively beneficial impact. People love the horses on Dartmoor, they think they look really cute, but they get really upset when you talk about eating them. But actually maybe I don't know for sure, but maybe we need less sheep and more horses on Dartmoor, but we're never going to achieve that, people aren't going to eat them. At some point in the future, hopefully we massively repopulate with beavers, but when they get too many of them, wouldn't it be great if we could just eat the extra ones?
And we need to eat some of the thousands of deer that are carved.
Yes, definitely need to eat the deer. A lot more, definitely need, particularly if we want the trees to grow, and maybe some grey squirrel, wouldn't it, actually? But the other thing is tree-based carbohydrates. So if we're looking at, I personally don't see, and actually it's one of the things that's missing from the room is the forestry industry. Are you a forester? Okay, sorry, Andy. But it's about an integrated system, and if we're looking at replanting, then yes, let's do that for biodiversity benefits, let's do that for timber benefits, but also there are a lot of tree-based carbohydrates we can access. Totally agree with your plan about having a county-wide plan. One of the things that we've been trying to look at, again, at Dartington, is actually how we take the big national data sets, like the UPSIP data sets, and figure out what they mean at a more regional level, and therefore how can we plan into future interventions into our landscape in the interests of both increasing the nutritional output of our landscape, but also looking at climate adaptation and resilience. And it would be amazing if we could do that at a county-wide level.
Yeah. Right. So a lot of what Harriet said, so we'll repeat that. Forest management is actually quite crucial for biodiversity. And looking at carbon anyway in this building is fantastic. And what I was going to say was really about the land use framework. We've actually sort of tried some of those things in North Devon generally, and with some of your colleagues at North Wick. The sustainable intensification platform that was tried. I think some people take the sustainable intensification terminology and run off in a different direction from what it was originally intended. The idea is the share or spare debate and how you sort of get that to work. And I think there's more room in actually trying to look at those kind of approaches much better. So continuing that research, get a SIP3 platform, perhaps with North Wick, and we're already talking with your colleagues about that. And that sort of brings that interesting debate then about sort of having to have options where, if we are saying matching land use with land capability is really what we're trying to do. Because in the past, we've got people growing maize on the sides of the hills that shouldn't really happen. It should be happening in other places. But if their enterprises need that, they need to be working much more cooperatively. So how do we start enabling that sharing of the use of land and nutrients to make that work effectively right across the piece? When it comes to some of the restoration stuff and where do you get your best bang for your buck, so where do you prioritise? And with the Pioneer, landscape scale Pioneer, we've been doing in North Devon. We've got a natural capital planning strategy, an investment strategy, and what we aim for is where is the force degraded land that's causing the biggest problems, that's where the biggest most instant returns. So that tends to be the land that isn't being used for what it can be used for, or should be used for, and it's the intensive grasslands. And they're the ones where we actually get more carbon in, we get better nutrient management, we also get further attenuation, and all those ecosystem services built in. And that's where the focus of that investment will try to ground that. So with the NEMS trials that we're doing, what we're trying to do is take a small landscape unit, water body, small catchment, work with the farmers in that area, and they will get, first of all, there'll be a consultation with the community to say what do we want from this area in terms of ecosystem services, benefits, public goods. We then visit the farms with a business advisor as an environmental advisor. And we look at how much the natural capital is actually part of the farm business, and how much it could be in terms of supply chain assurance with whatever sort of contracts they have. And then we'd look at what's the gap and how can that gap be met. So the idea is actually taking that whole systems approach, business and environment, linking the two together, because as I said, in the past it's always been very much a dichotomy. It's always been nature conservation and sort of the farm business, but we're actually trying to put the two together to make sure that there is actually more resilience in the program. Because what we've seen in the past is people get a stewardship agreement, lasts 5 or 10 years. After year 10, it gets planned, and then that's just because the way the farmers have had to work with the kind of economies they have. So that's the way we're trying to change the testing this.
And we're just ask for some clarification about when you said sustainable development, sustainable intensification going off in a different direction. Yeah. What were the two directions you were mentioning there? Would the kind of, it sounds great that Elms trial, would that represent one of those directions?
So the sustainable intensification literally was, where can we sort of back away from intensive farming, and where can we improve the yields without actually without increasing the environmental impact, and how do we do that? But I think it's gone to the point where the focus on the intensification part has really gone super agri-tech, which could be okay. And we need to think about that, but it's obviously sort of then forgot about how does that fit in the land use framework. It's my expectations, and you don't want to create a Frankenstein in some of the architects.
I have 3 very quick points. The first one's going back to your point earlier about carbon tax. When I was talking earlier about internalising costs, I deliberately did not say the word tax. I think the sectors that we're looking at here, with agriculture and food, are so tightly strong at the minute that any discussion of tax around this, I think, is far too contentious, and I don't think it's helpful. The idea of coming in with a carbon tax on farmers or on consumers at this moment would be a bad idea. There's economic instruments we could use, and it's something we should investigate, but that was why I deliberately. Mention that word. £200 for a carbon per tonne of carbon is
I think that was mentioned in the context of at what level do we value farming support interventions that they might make.
Yeah, and there's a place for the discussion around that. I think although we need these national level approaches, they have to be driven or co-owned by local to regional people as well. I think this is really important, and it worries me when I hear this. I imagine, this idea of the government coming in and coming up with these ridiculous new incentives and initiatives. I think we need a much better link between local, regional, and national. £200 per tonne is very high. £60 average, £20. There's a massive range of price per tonne. Be very careful. Do not just take £200. Would be
that's why I was
with my caution. Yeah. Well, again, I feel uneasy hearing numbers like that bandied around.
Imagine most farmers would feel pretty happy.
The carbon tax issue. The second thing, I think, following up on what Andy was saying a little, is this need to take a Devon-wide approach in our planning. So in the UCAP project, which I work, we've got national level models where we can change land use in different areas, and you can take a whole approach, a very holistic approach, and having this spatial resolution to see if we change what's happening here, what does that mean for in North Devon? What does that mean for South Devon? And I think this is going to be really important. And this is not by the sky. I mean, we have models that we can do this with, that we can develop. It's about linking academic research with what's happening on the ground. Being careful, of course, that Devon is actually linked to other counties and keeping this in mind. And perhaps catchment-based models might be better than other models. Final, very quick point on the vegan issue. I support what everybody said here, that it should be about eating less meat, high quality meat. This is the same for fisheries, though. I think this is really important to mention. And like we were saying, we should potentially eat horses and deer, squirrels. Quite possibly. It's the same with the fish. I mean, we don't eat a lot of the fish that we catch. We export a lot of the fish that we catch in the UK. I think we need to be thinking about how we can really make the most of our local.
Yes.
I think my point follows on very nicely from Nikki, that Devon doesn't end at the coastline. We've talked an awful lot, and I think it's based on who's been assembled here. So there's been very little talk on agriculture and fisheries, and we are not going to feed this planet without using resourced foodstuffs. And Devon is well placed to take the lead on good sustainable practices, be that through the harvesting of marine protein or through the farming and culturing of that as well, and finding a good balance between all the ways in which we generate foodstuffs.
Very quick, I just wanted to sort of give a sort of supporting nod to the catchment-based models. I think they make a lot of sense, especially in Devon Valley.
Yeah.
Can I suggest that we break for coffee, but please make use of the post-it system for all the unmade points that you'd like to record.
Specifically about farming and soil, Jill, or anything?
About anything. And I should say that we hope to spend a little bit of our time at the end to recap what are the key things that we would like to plan to reflect. So we will have a go round at the very end for a minute each to just recap what our key things are. But we want to capture it in as many ways as possible. It's been tremendously helpful and rich discussion. Thank you.
And if we've got written, like I've written my evidence, can we also submit that?
I would be very grateful if you would do that, please. To ask the chairs, and I think you have Emily's email on the invitation that you will have had. So if you can submit things in written form, it would be helpful for us to just pinpoint the points that you've made. But having said that, we have very good note takers, and they are capturing a lot of what you said here. So we'll read